Well, hey guys, Gaji here as we kind of continue our little skip through the 70s. So we left off last time, Nixon resigns, and we have this new guy, Gerald Ford takes office. Now, a couple of little interesting little bits here. Um, Gerald Ford actually wasn't Nixon's vice president when Nixon was reelected in 72. Nixon's vice president was a guy by the name of Spiro Agnew out of Maryland. I think that's right. And what's interesting, and it's really kind of indicative of everything going on in the 70s with all this scandal, Spiro Agnew himself was embroiled in a scandal. This is before Watergate, um, where he ended up resigning, and it was unrelated. So we've already had a scandal with Spiro Agnew who resigns, and Nixon, as president, then appointed Gerald Ford to be the vice president. And then obviously, when Nixon resigns, we have Gerald Ford being president. So that's interesting because number one, you just see just kind of just this upheaval happening in our executive branch between the vice president and the president. We talk about this theme of declining trust, right? And now, who's our new president? Well, okay, Gerald Ford. But the thing is that the American people never voted for him. He was never on a national ticket. You know, every 4 years we go and we vote for a ticket of the president and vice president. Gerald Ford was a congressperson. He's from Michigan. But now the president of the United States was never on a national ticket. And he's the only president that's like that. That's a very challenging part of him. Now, he wasn't, certainly an unknown person. People would have known who he was. He was the vice president, after all. Um, it's funny. He's the type of guy um, he, he was criticized kind of for being, by some, certainly the people that didn't like his politics, for being unintelligent, which isn't right. He was kind of considered, to think of it, how do I put it, like a dumb jock. He was actually one of our most athletic presidents we've ever had. He was a star college football player. But some people kind of took that as like, oh, he's just an idiot. But, you may disagree with his politics, but I don't think that's right. And just real quick, this is a little bit of an aside. It's funny because there's a couple times as president where I think one time he like hit his head on something or kind of slipped downstairs, something like that. And then he was parodied on Saturday Night Live, which was starting at that time. Hopefully you've heard of Saturday Night Live, as being kind of this big clumsy president. So I always feel bad for Gerald Ford because on the one hand, he was seen as like by some as this dumb jock, and then he's parodied on Saturday Night Live as being this kind of doofus when he's in fact, you know, incredibly athletic. Anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. But he takes office, and within a month, does something that ends up really kind of taking off the American people to a pretty high degree, as you'll see, in pardoning Richard Nixon. So the president has the power of the pardon to absolve people of their crimes when they've committed a federal crime. And this is Ford. I'll play this for you. Ford on television explaining to the American people what he's doing and why he's doing
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we as a great and good nation can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
So, why did he pardon Nixon? I talk about, the suffering stuff in there. But in the end, Nixon resigned because he kind of didn't, his argument, Nixon's argument was, I'm going to resign to just kind of, let's put this matter to rest. Because if he didn't resign, there's going to be an impeachment hearing and then removal hearings and trials. And, Nixon didn't want to put the country through that. Now, you could also argue he resigned so he didn't have to be embarrassed and, shamed in front of Congress. And there's probably truth to both of that. But the idea is that Ford wanted to pardon the president because he also wanted to end this thing. He didn't want these investigations to continue to distract. Now, you could also argue he's pardoning Nixon, which basically is saying, hey, all right, Nixon, you did these bad things. And he also pardoned stuff that we didn't know he did yet. So you could say he's just basically covering up everything that Nixon did. And there's an argument to be made there. But either way, he's trying to put this thing, Watergate, to bed. Think about the levels of trust in government, how it's really suffered during all this. And he's trying to put this away. Let's move to the future. Well, public doesn't like this too much, as you can see. So his is just looking at the blue line here, right? His approval rating when he takes office is 70%, which is incredibly high. There was no way he was going to keep that. It was probably that high just because he wasn't Nixon. But you can see pretty quickly it just collapses, especially, you can see that first real quick dip when he pardons the president, and it continues down. And then it ends up at levels which are a little bit below average for a president, but certainly not terrible. But the point is that I think when we think about this overall theme of this decline of trust, I think his pardon of Nixon really just kind of fed into this idea. Oh my God, this government, right? All this scandal, go back to Vietnam and they're misleading us and they're lying to us and they're this scandal and abusing power. Nixon abused power, and so Gerald Ford uses the powers of the presidency to help another president who's abusing his powers. You can just see how frustrated people get. And so you add this lack of trust to something else completely separate now that I want to get to that's happening in the 70s, and that's really the economic problems of the 70s. Because now we're seeing a period of time where we are seeing some pretty severe decline in economic growth, unemployment we'll talk about. Our country really is seeing a time where that standard of living, which we saw increase so quickly and so rapidly throughout the 50s and 60s, a period of relative prosperity for a lot of people, that's stagnating. That's starting to go away. Now, there's a lot of different reasons that I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but there's a couple things I do want to mention here. Number one, the country sees a pretty significant decline in manufacturing, making stuff. Like, think cars. Cars is a really good example for this. Well, for the big chunk of, the 50s and 60s, American cars, we were the producer. Again, not just cars, but we were the producer of stuff worldwide, especially right after the war. Why? Well, an obvious reason was because literally all these other countries that could be industrial powers and were industrial powers were destroyed by the war. We were all we had. But what happens is you get into the 50s and 60s, they're recovering, especially places like Japan and Germany. And then pretty soon, without that competition, we don't improve fast enough and they start to overtake us in some places. An automobile would be a really good example of that. As more and more people said, wait a minute, these American cars, aren't as reliable, don't look as nice. And so, hey, let's start buying Volkswagens. Let's start buying Toyotas. And that's what starts to happen. And so that leads to, again, I don't want to say it's just because of the car industry, but that leads to a decline. Now, sort of related to cars is another really important thing in the 70s. And that's oil prices, gas prices. So to tell the quick story here, by 1970, we're really dependent on foreign oil, meaning the gas we put in our cars, that oil is coming not from the United States. Where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from the Middle East because they had found these huge oil deposits in the Middle East, and they start getting that oil, and they sell it to us for cheap. So we're kind of like, well, why should we make our own when we're buying it for cheap from the Middle East, right? And well, it's all good until other geopolitical events get involved. So the Arab nations, so these are like Saudi Arabia, so the Middle East, these Arab nations, again, think of them, this will help, usually not necessarily Muslim governments, but Muslim nations. They'd come together in this collective known as OPEC, which still exists today. So they kind of get together and say, as a collection of nations, we will kind of pool all resources to sell oil to countries around the world, people around the world. Well, they get angry at the United States because we end up supporting Israel, the Jewish state in the Middle East, which was created right after World War II. Again, I don't want to get into a long thing on Israel and the Middle East, but to understand that we sided with Israel, as we traditionally do. Arab nations did not like that, so they started this oil embargo. They stopped selling oil to us as retaliation. This creates an incredible oil shortage and is going to lead to increased prices. You can see we're being held hostage by our dependence on foreign oil. And gas prices are important because we all see them. We all are very acutely aware at any given time when they go up, when they go down, something that everybody uses. And so what we start to see throughout the 70s are periods of scenes like this. Not only increased prices, but shortages where people are waiting in long lines for gas. Now, I don't want to get you the impression that the entire decade of the 70s and all over the country was always like this. There's going to be little, parts that are like this. But this is happening. And it's something that's happening throughout the 70s. So you can see here, this is a sign referring to Nixon. Oh, we got a gas shortage. Nixon's fault. But this problem will exist under President Ford. And then later, President we haven't mentioned yet, but President Carter. This happens, this is a crisis throughout the 70s. Just a couple other pictures here, and you can see also the Volkswagen, so the German car, with the gas shortage. And then one of the things that we actually do to try to fix the problem, because you can't just fix it overnight. We can't just start having our own oil. It takes a while. We can't just start overnight to make really gas efficient cars. So what we do is the federal government comes in and tells the states, hey, look, on all the highways in your state, you have to lower the speed limit to no more than 55 miles an hour. Just think how slow that would be if all the highways were 55 miles an hour. Well, the government had to think of something, because by slowing people down, that creates more, better gas mileage. And this actually stayed in place for a long time. This was originally put in 1973, and I started driving in 89, and I remember 55 mile an hour roads. It was right around that time that they finally gave the states the ability to have their own speed limits again. But this is kind of the condition, these are between that decline in manufacturing, these rising oil prices, again, what's happening to our country? And on top of that, we have something known as stagflation. So this is a tricky one, but in terms of economics. But we had this economic problem, essentially kind of almost invented a word for, where you had high unemployment. So lots of people looking for jobs that don't have jobs. Now, usually when unemployment is high, I mean, a lot of people are looking for jobs, inflation is low, meaning inflation refers to, the value of a dollar. So the idea is that there's a lot of inflation, a dollar buys you less stuff, prices are too high. Usually those things kind of go like this, when one's up, one's down, and the other way around. Problem in the 70s was that they're both pretty stubbornly high, and economic growth was just bottoming out, as you can see right here. So you have inflation and unemployment really pretty high, and you can just see this bottoming out of our economic growth. Our economy is suffering. So hopefully it's kind of hard to, if I'm explaining that okay. But even if you don't understand exactly the inflation, unemployment stuff. Understand this. The economy in the 70s was suffering. It was stagnant. People were very aware of it because, well, like I take somebody like my parents' age, right? In the 70s, they're adults now, they're starting a family. And so they have a very recent memory of growing up in the 50s and seeing that prosperity around them, seeing that quick growth of that standard of living that they weren't necessarily seeing in the 70s. And so for a lot of folks, you look around you growing up, you become like in your 20s or so, or whatever, in the 70s, right? And you're used to this period of economic growth that isn't happening anymore. And then you add on top of that Vietnam, Nixon, Watergate, all this stuff. This is what's all contributing to that lack of trust. And the fact of the matter is, this is what I'll leave you with, is that throughout the 70s, we really struggled to deal with these economic problems. Yeah, there were moments where it was like looking a little bit better, but then moments where not so much. But none of us were really to solve that problem in the 70s. And which is going to bring us finally, I'm going to talk about in the next video, the last president of the 70s, Jimmy Carter. And we'll come back and talk about that. So thanks, guys. We'll see you in a bit.